Say that again. Claire Sterling murmured with a smile that never reached her eyes, her voice smooth as polished glass. But this time, remember who you are. The words didn't echo, they settled, heavy and deliberate, slicing clean through the soft jazz drifting across the private dining room, perched 30 floors above Manhattan, where crystal glasses hovered midair and conversations folded into silence like paper under pressure, because everyone heard it, everyone felt it, and everyone turned just enough to see the young black waitress standing beside the table, tray balanced steady in her hands, posture straight, eyes lowered, as if the moment had already passed for her even while it was just beginning for everyone else. The room was built for power, $500,000 deals whispered between courses, tailored suits and quiet dominance, a place where people didn't raise their voices because they never needed to, and at the center of it all sat Daniel Sterling, the man whose signature could move markets, whose presence alone bent conversations toward him. But tonight his attention wasn't on the investors or the contract waiting beneath a leather folder. It flickered, subtle but sharp, toward the woman who had just spoken, and the one standing in front of her, because something in the air had shifted, something small but undeniable. Zariah Monroe didn't move right away, not the way people expected, no flinch, no apology rushed out of habit, just a stillness that didn't belong to someone in her position, the kind of stillness that suggested she wasn't trying to disappear, even though everyone in the room had spent the last hour treating her like part of the furniture, another invisible figure refilling glasses, clearing plates, existing only when needed and forgotten the second she stepped away, and yet here she was at the center of attention without asking for it, without reacting to it, her fingers steady around the stem of a wine glass as she leaned in just enough to complete the task she had started before the interruption. Claire exhaled softly, amused, as if the silence itself entertained her, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she tilted her head. Studying Zariah the way someone studies an object they've already decided has no value, and around the table, a few guests shifted, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, because in rooms like this, power decided what was acceptable, and Claire Sterling had long learned how to use that power without ever raising her voice. You people always think silence makes you look strong, she added lightly, her tone wrapped in elegance. But it just makes you forgettable. A quiet ripple of laughter followed, thin and cautious, the kind that didn't come from humor but from alignment, from people choosing the safer side of the moment, and still, Zariah didn't look up, didn't rush, didn't shrink. She simply placed the glass down with precision, adjusted the napkin beside it, and for a brief second, her reflection caught in the polished surface of the table, calm, composed, unreadable. Daniel noticed that, the absence of reaction, the lack of fear, because he had spent years reading people, predicting hesitation, exploiting weakness, and what stood in front of him now didn't match the script he knew so well, and something about that unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, lights blinking like distant signals, but inside the room, everything had narrowed to this moment, this quiet standoff no one had planned, where one person believed she owned the space, and another stood within it without asking permission. And just as the tension threatened to dissolve into awkward normalcy, just as someone reached for their drink to pretend nothing had happened, Zariah finally spoke, her voice low, even, almost gentle, the kind of voice that didn't demand attention, yet somehow claimed it anyway. And she didn't lift her gaze, didn't meet Claire's eyes. She simply said, "Daniel Sterling, you still review every final contract yourself, even the ones your board thinks you've already approved." And just like that, the room changed. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Not even the servers along the wall who had mastered the art of disappearing, because the sentence did not sound like a guess, it sounded like a fact. Precise and uninvited, the kind of detail that did not belong to a stranger carrying a tray, and Daniel Sterling felt it before he reacted, a subtle tightening in his chest, a flicker behind his eyes, because what she had said was true, not the public version of him, not the version his board believed, but the real one, the habit he never spoke about, the quiet control he kept hidden even from those closest to him. Claire let out a short laugh, sharp and dismissive, as if the moment could be erased with sound alone, but it landed flat, too quick, too forced, and the people around the table noticed, not openly, not enough to challenge her, but enough to shift their posture, enough to lean slightly back instead of forward, because something no longer felt predictable. "That is quite a guess," Claire said, her tone tightening just enough to reveal the crack beneath it, her fingers curling around the stem of her glass. "But guessing is not the same as knowing." Zariah did not respond immediately. She simply stepped back half a pace, giving the table space as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just redirected the entire room. And that calm, that refusal to perform, unsettled the balance even more, because people expected either defiance or apology, not composure. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than before, quieter, but carrying further, cutting through the silence without effort. It was not a guess. It was not a question, it was a statement, and when he said it, every conversation in the room disappeared completely, replaced by the soft hum of the city outside and the almost imperceptible sound of someone shifting in their chair. Claire turned toward him, surprised, her expression flickering between confusion and irritation, because this was not how these moments were supposed to unfold, not in her world, not in a room she believed she controlled. "Daniel," she said, carefully, as if reminding him of his role, "she is a server." The word hung there, meant to shrink, meant to simplify, meant to restore order, but it did not land the way it used to, because Daniel was still looking at Zariah, not as background, not as interruption, but as a question he could not yet answer. Zariah lifted the empty bottle from the table, her movements smooth, unhurried, her gaze still lowered, and for a brief second, it seemed as though she might walk away, allow the moment to dissolve into uncertainty, leave them to wonder if it had meant anything at all, and that possibility, that lack of closure, pulled tighter than any confrontation could have, because uncertainty demands attention. "You always read the last page twice," she added softly, almost as an afterthought, as if she were recalling something ordinary, something small, yet the effect was immediate. Daniel's hand stilled against the table, the smallest motion freezing in place, because that was not public, that was not documented, that was not something anyone in the room could have known, not even his executive team, not even Claire. A breath passed through the table, collective and unspoken, the kind of shift that happens when reality no longer aligns with expectation. And now the silence was no longer controlled by status or wealth, it was controlled by her. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice no longer distant, no longer neutral, but focused, precise. "Where did you learn that?" And for the first time, Zariah paused, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if deciding whether the next word would open a door or close it forever, the weight of it settling quietly into the space between them while every person in the room waited. Not for permission, not for hierarchy, but for truth. Zariah did not rush to answer, and that pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not awkward, but deliberate, the kind of silence that forces people to sit inside their own thoughts. And Daniel felt it more than anyone else, because every second that passed made one thing clearer. She was not improvising, she was remembering, and memory cannot be challenged the way guesses can. Around the table, eyes shifted between them, some curious, some cautious, all aware that something far more significant than a passing comment was unfolding, because power had just been interrupted, not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely, and precision is what unsettles people who are used to control. Claire straightened in her chair, her posture tightening as she set her glass down with a little more force than necessary, the faint sound echoing against the crystal and wood, drawing attention back to her as she attempted to reclaim it. "Daniel, this is getting unnecessary," she said, her voice measured but sharper now. "We have a deal on the table, not a performance." The word performance lingered, meant to reduce the moment, to frame Zariah as nothing more than a distraction, but it no longer carried the same authority, because the room had already shifted, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. Zariah finally lifted her gaze. Not fully, not dramatically, just enough to meet Daniel's eyes for the first time, and when she did, it was not confrontational, it was not emotional, it was something far more unsettling, it was recognition. "You trained me to notice patterns," she said quietly, her voice steady, clear, and completely unshaken. even the ones people think no one sees. The sentence landed differently than anything before it, because it did not just reveal knowledge, it implied history, and Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, but searching, as if he were moving through years of faces, meetings, names, trying to find the one that matched the voice standing in front of him. I have trained a lot of people, he replied, carefully, but the certainty in his tone had faded, replaced by something closer to doubt. Zariah nodded once, a small acknowledgement, as if she expected that answer, as if she had already accounted for it. Most of them were allowed to stay, she added, and there it was, the shift from mystery to meaning, subtle but undeniable, because now the room understood this was not coincidence, this was consequence. A quiet murmur moved through the far end of the table, quickly silenced, not by command, but by tension, because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, not when it felt like the truth was about to surface in a place where truth was usually managed, edited, controlled. Claire exhaled sharply, her patience thinning, her composure slipping, just enough to show the strain beneath it. "This is inappropriate," she said, more firmly now. "Whatever you think you remember, this is not the place." But the words no longer carried the same weight, because the room was no longer hers to control, not completely, not in this moment, and Daniel did not respond to her this time. His attention fixed entirely on Zariah, because something in her voice had reached past his present and into something he had not revisited in years. "Tell me your name," he said, not as a demand, but as a request shaped by urgency, and that alone shifted the power again, because powerful men do not usually ask, they expect, they assume, they decide, but this was different. Zariah held his gaze for a fraction longer, then looked back down, returning to the quiet composure she had never lost, as if the answer did not need to be dramatic to be undeniable. "Zariah Monroe," she said, and the name settled into the room like a key turning in a lock, subtle, quiet, but irreversible, because Daniel did not move right away. He did not speak. He simply sat there, the recognition arriving not all at once, but in pieces, fragments aligning into something he could no longer ignore, while the rest of the room watched, waiting, not for a reaction, but for the moment when certainty would replace doubt. Daniel did not blink when he heard the name, but something deeper shifted, something quieter and far more dangerous than surprise, because recognition does not arrive with noise, it arrives with weight, and it settles slowly, pressing against memory until it cannot be ignored, and in that moment, the room was no longer a dining room. It was a timeline folding back on itself, every polished surface reflecting not just the present, but something unfinished from the past. Zariah Monroe. The name repeated in his mind, not as a stranger's identity, but as a fragment of something he had once seen, once evaluated, once dismissed, and the realization did not come all at once. It moved in pieces, a file, a meeting, a quiet voice in a room where louder ones had been rewarded, and suddenly the pattern was not abstract anymore. It had a face, it had a presence, it was standing in front of him holding a bottle like it weighed nothing at all. "You were in the innovation cohort," Daniel said slowly, the words forming as memory aligned with certainty. And it was not a question, it was confirmation, the kind that reveals more about the speaker than the subject, because now everyone at the table understood that whatever this was, it was real. Zariah gave the smallest nod, not proud, not defensive, simply acknowledging a fact that had always existed whether it was remembered or not. And that calm acceptance unsettled the room even more, because it removed any sense of performance, any possibility that this was accidental. Claire's expression tightened, her eyes moving quickly between them, calculating, reassessing, because this was no longer a moment she could dismiss with tone or posture. This was history, and history does not respond to social cues. "Daniel," she said again, softer this time but more urgent, "we are here to finalize a deal, not revisit old hiring decisions." The word hiring was chosen carefully, reduced, contained, made smaller than it actually was, but the room had already moved past that simplification, and Daniel did not respond, not immediately, because he was still looking at Zariah, not as a server, not as an interruption, but as a variable he had once misjudged. "You submitted a systems model," he continued, his voice steady but no longer distant. Predictive scaling for adaptive platforms. A few people at the table exchanged glances, not because they fully understood the reference, but because they recognized the shift, the movement from surface conversation into something deeper, something that belonged in boardrooms and strategy sessions, not beside a table set for dinner. Zoraya's hands remained steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her presence, not an increase, not an escalation, just a quiet alignment, as if she were no longer holding back what had always been there. It was not just predictive, she replied, her voice even. It was corrective. It identified failure points before they appeared. The precision of her words cut clean through the space, and now it was not just Daniel who was paying attention. It was everyone, because expertise reveals itself differently than confidence. It does not need volume. It carries weight on its own. Daniel exhaled slowly. The memory now fully formed, undeniable, and with it came something else, something less comfortable, the realization of what had been overlooked, what had been set aside, not because it lacked value, but because it did not fit a narrative that had already been decided. We did not move forward with that model, he said, but the sentence lacked conviction, because even as he said it, he knew it was incomplete, a partial truth shaped by convenience. Zoraya did not challenge him directly. She did not need to. She simply added, "You moved forward without it." And the distinction landed with quiet force, because it shifted responsibility without accusation. It revealed consequence without raising her voice. And in that moment, the power dynamic changed again, not through confrontation, but through clarity, the kind that cannot be argued with, only recognized. And around them, the room remained still, not out of politeness, but because something real was finally being acknowledged in a place where reality was usually filtered before it was ever allowed to exist. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling across the table like a weight no one had prepared to carry, because what Zoraya had just done was not an argument. It was a correction, and corrections in rooms like this are not welcome. They are remembered, and Daniel Sterling understood that better than anyone, which is why he did not speak right away. Why his hand remained still against the polished surface, as if even the smallest movement might disrupt the clarity forming in his mind. Around him, the investors shifted in their seats, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but enough to create distance, subtle inches of space that signaled a shift in alignment. Because power is rarely abandoned, but it is often reconsidered, especially when uncertainty enters the room. Claire noticed it immediately, the way eyes no longer followed her, the way attention had moved, and for the first time that evening, she did not look composed. She looked calculated, as if she were trying to solve a problem that had not existed a moment ago. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice no longer light, no longer controlled in the same effortless way. "Daniel, we are not going to entertain this." The word entertain landed wrong, too dismissive for the tension it attempted to contain, and no one echoed it this time. No polite laughter, no supportive glance, just silence, because everyone at the table now understood that this was not entertainment, this was exposure. Zoraya did not respond to Claire, not directly. She did not challenge her, did not acknowledge her authority, and that absence of engagement was louder than any reply could have been, because it redirected the entire moment back to Daniel, where it now belonged. "You presented the final version 3 weeks later," Zoraya continued, her voice calm, measured, as if she were recalling a timeline rather than confronting a decision. But the correction layer was gone. The words were precise, technical, undeniable, and even those who did not fully understand the details could feel the implication. Something important had been removed, something intentional, something that changed the outcome. Daniel inhaled slowly, the memory now fully reconstructed, not just the submission, not just the meeting, but the discussion that followed, the decision that seemed efficient at the time, the rationale that had been easy to justify in a room full of agreement. "It was not aligned with the direction we chose," he said, but the explanation felt thinner now, less certain, because direction is often shaped by perspective, and perspective is never neutral. Zoraya gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in recognition of the reasoning, as if she had already considered it long before this moment, long before this room. "It was aligned with the outcome," she replied quietly, and the distinction settled heavily, Because outcomes cannot be debated the way strategies can. They exist, they unfold, they reveal what decisions could not predict. A man at the far end of the table leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer hidden, because now this was not just a personal exchange. It was a business reality, the kind that affects numbers, projections, reputations, and suddenly the dinner felt less like a celebration and more like a review, an unexpected one, but no less real. Claire's fingers tightened around her glass again, her composure slipping further as she realized the room was no longer hers to steer, no longer responsive to her tone or her presence, and that loss of control was something she had not prepared for. "Enough," she said, sharper now, the word cutting through the space with urgency. "This is inappropriate and irrelevant." But even as she said it, she knew it was neither, because relevance had already been established, not by volume, not by authority, but by truth, and truth does not require permission to exist. Daniel finally looked away from Zariah, just for a second, scanning the table, reading the room the way he always had. But what he saw was different now, not agreement, not compliance, but expectation, a silent demand for clarity, for acknowledgement, for something real in a space that rarely allowed it. When his gaze returned to her, it was no longer searching, it was certain, and in that certainty was something unexpected, not defensiveness, not dismissal, but recognition, the kind that comes too late to change the past, but just in time to reshape the present. And for the first time that night, the balance of power did not belong to wealth, or status, or position. It belonged to the person who had nothing to protect and everything to reveal. Daniel did not speak immediately, and that restraint, that refusal to rush into explanation or defense, carried more weight than any quick response could have, because it signaled something unfamiliar in a room like this, consideration, and as the silence stretched, it became clear that this was no longer about a single decision made years ago. It was about what that decision revealed, about how easily something valuable had been set aside because it did not fit the image, the timing, the expectation of what success was supposed to look like. He leaned back slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the table as if grounding himself in the present while his mind revisited the past, not as memory, but as accountability. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, not louder, not softer, but clearer, stripped of performance. "We chose speed over precision," he said, and the admission landed differently than anything before it, because it was not framed as strategy, it was framed as truth, and truth, once spoken, cannot be reshaped to fit comfort. A quiet shift moved through the room again, not dramatic, not visible to anyone outside of it, but unmistakable to those inside, because this was not how these dinners usually went, this was not how power usually behaved, and for a brief moment, the hierarchy that had defined the evening felt less certain. Zariah listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, no triumph, just a calm recognition of something she had already known long before this night, long before this room, long before anyone here had decided to pay attention. "Precision takes longer," she replied, her voice even, almost reflective, "but it prevents what speed creates." The sentence settled into the space with quiet force, not as criticism, not as correction, but as clarity, and even those who had been silent until now felt it, the weight of something simple and undeniable. Claire exhaled sharply, her patience finally giving way to frustration, the control she had maintained slipping into something more reactive, more visible. "This is not a lecture," she said, her tone tightening as she turned fully toward Daniel. "And it is certainly not the place for this kind of conversation." But the room no longer responded to her the way it had before, no immediate agreement, no subtle reinforcement, just stillness, because the focus had shifted beyond her reach. Daniel did not look at her right away, and that alone said more than any response could have, because it was not dismissal, it was prioritization, a decision made in real time about what mattered in this moment. "It is exactly the place," he said finally, his voice steady, not confrontational, but firm in a way that left no room for interpretation. "Because this room is built on decisions like that one." The statement reframed everything, not as a disruption, but as a reflection, and the people at the table understood it. not just intellectually, but professionally, because every one of them had made choices shaped by similar pressures, similar assumptions, similar blind spots. Zariah lowered her gaze again, returning to the quiet composure that had never left her, as if the moment did not require her to stand at the center of it, as if she had only ever intended to place the truth where it could be seen and then step back. You did not just remove a layer, she added softly, almost as if completing a thought. You removed the safeguard that would have protected the system from its own growth. The implications settled slowly, deeply, because now this was not just about a past decision. It was about its impact, its reach, its consequences beyond what had been measured or reported. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in realization, because he understood systems, he understood scale, and more importantly, he understood what it meant when something fundamental was missing from the foundation. Around the table, the atmosphere had shifted completely, no longer defined by status or presentation, but by something far more rare in spaces like this, awareness. And in that awareness, the balance of power continued to move, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, toward the one person who had entered the room with nothing but truth and the willingness to let it speak for itself. The weight of her last sentence did not fade. It settled, deep and immovable, like something that had always been true but had only now been allowed to exist in the open. And for a moment no one at the table reached for their glass. No one checked their phone. No one tried to redirect the conversation, because what Zariah had placed in the center of the room was not just a flaw in a system. It was a mirror, and mirrors do not ask permission before they reflect. Daniel remained still, his gaze fixed somewhere just past her, not avoiding, not dismissing, but processing, because he understood exactly what she meant, not just technically, but strategically, the kind of understanding that does not need explanation, and with it came something far less comfortable than error, responsibility. We scaled faster than we validated, he said slowly, almost to himself, but the room heard it clearly, and this time there was no attempt to frame it as a decision, no attempt to soften it into language that sounded intentional. It was simply what it was, and that honesty shifted the atmosphere again, subtly but powerfully. Zariah did not interrupt, did not confirm. She simply allowed the realization to exist, because she did not need to push it further. It was already moving on its own. At the far end of the table, one of the investors leaned forward, his expression no longer passive, no longer detached, because now this was no longer a personal exchange. It was a business risk, a structural concern, the kind that could not be ignored once it had been named. Are you saying the current platform has an unaddressed vulnerability? He asked carefully, choosing his words with precision. And suddenly the conversation had shifted completely, no longer centered on Zariah, but on what she had revealed. And that was the real shift, not attention, but impact. Claire's composure fractured in a way she could no longer hide, her voice sharper, her control thinner. "This is completely inappropriate," she said, her tone cutting through the room. "We are not going to let a server derail a multi-million-dollar negotiation with speculation." The word speculation hung there, but it did not land the way she intended, because uncertainty had already been replaced with possibility, and possibility, especially in rooms like this, demands verification. Daniel finally turned toward her, his expression calm but no longer aligned with hers, not dismissive, not confrontational, but distant in a way that carried finality. "It is not speculation," he said quietly, and that quiet carried more authority than anything louder could have, because it came from recognition, not assumption. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but the moment had already moved past her, the room no longer waiting for her direction, no longer responding to her cues, because the center of gravity had shifted completely. Zariah adjusted the edge of the table setting in front of her, a small, precise movement that contrasted the magnitude of what had just unfolded, and in that contrast was something undeniable. She had not come to disrupt. She had not come to prove anything. She had simply spoken when the moment required it, and then stepped back, allowing the truth to carry itself. "You built something powerful," she said softly, her voice returning to that same calm tone it had always held. "But power without correction does not stabilize, it amplifies." The sentence lingered, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a reality, one that extended beyond the room, beyond the dinner, into something much larger than any single deal. Daniel exhaled slowly, the full scope of it settling into place, not just the missed opportunity, not just the decision, but the consequence of both. And in that moment, the version of control he had relied on for years shifted into something else, something quieter, something more aware. Around the table, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were recalculating, reassessing, rethinking what they had assumed when they walked into the room. And in that silence, the hierarchy that had defined the evening dissolved completely, replaced by something far more rare, truth without permission, and the undeniable realization that the person they had not seen at all was now the one who had changed everything. No one returned to their meal, not because they had forgotten it, but because the idea of continuing as if nothing had changed now felt impossible, like trying to resume a conversation after the truth has already been spoken out loud. And Daniel understood that better than anyone, because he could see it in the way the investors were no longer looking at him with certainty, but with calculation, with questions forming behind composed expressions, the kind of questions that do not wait for permission before they influence decisions. He straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to meet the moment as it had become, his voice calm but carrying a new weight. If there is even a fraction of what she is describing in the system, we need to verify it immediately. And that sentence changed everything, because it moved the conversation from doubt to action, from past to present, from personal to operational. A man near the center of the table nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone before stopping himself, aware of the optics, aware of the room. But the instinct was there, undeniable, because this was no longer about perception, it was about risk. Claire stared at Daniel, disbelief flashing across her face before it hardened into something colder, more controlled, but less effective than before. "You are going to take direction from her," she said, each word measured, but the control behind them no longer absolute. In the middle of this negotiation, the emphasis on her carried frustration, but it also revealed something else, distance, a line that had just been drawn without her consent. Daniel turned toward her fully now, and for the first time that night, there was no hesitation in his response. "I am taking responsibility for something I should have addressed years ago." And the clarity of that statement left no room for reinterpretation, no space for deflection, because responsibility cannot be outsourced once it is claimed. Zariah remained still, her presence unchanged, as if the conversation no longer required her to hold it together, as if it had reached a point where truth was moving on its own momentum, and that quiet confidence made her even more impossible to ignore. "There was a fallback structure," she said softly, not interrupting, not correcting, simply adding what needed to be said. It was designed to activate when growth exceeded projected limits, but it was removed before deployment. The technical precision returned, grounding the conversation in something tangible, something measurable, and now the room was no longer dealing with abstraction, but with architecture, with design, with decisions that had real consequences beyond the walls they sat within. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if each word was aligning with something he could now see clearly, something that had been hidden by momentum and success. "And without it, the system compensates on its own," he said, finishing the thought not as a question, but as a realization, and Zariah gave the slightest acknowledgement, confirming without needing to elaborate further. The investors exchanged looks, no longer subtle, no longer cautious, because the implications were now too significant to ignore, and in that shift, the balance of power completed its transition, no longer centered on who held the most status, but on who held the most truth. Claire leaned back, her silence now louder than her words had been, because there was nothing left to dismiss, nothing left to reframe, only something to confront, and that was not a position she had prepared for. Daniel placed his hand flat against the table, grounding himself once more, not in control, but in clarity. "We are pausing this discussion," he said, his voice steady, final, and the room accepted it without resistance, because it was no longer about the deal, not yet. It was about understanding what had just been uncovered. Zariah stepped back slightly, returning to the edge of the space she had always occupied, but now that space felt entirely different, not invisible, not peripheral, but essential, because she had not just entered the room, she had changed it. And as the city lights continued to flicker beyond the glass, indifferent to what had just unfolded, everyone inside understood something quietly but completely, that the most important voice in the room had been the one they almost never heard. The room did not erupt. It did not fracture into chaos or noise. Instead, it settled into something far more rare, a quiet realignment. The kind that happens when people begin to see clearly after having looked past something for too long. And in that stillness, every person at the table understood that the evening they had planned no longer existed. It had been replaced by something else, something unplanned but far more important. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, his hand still resting against the table, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, as if he were marking the exact point where everything had shifted. And when he finally stood, it was not to dominate the room, not to reclaim authority, but to acknowledge what had just happened in a way that could not be undone. "We will reconvene after a full internal review," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but no longer distant, and the investors nodded, not out of obligation, but out of agreement, because what had been revealed could not be ignored, not if they intended to move forward with anything that required trust. Claire did not stand. She remained seated, her expression composed but distant, as if she were still trying to locate the moment where control had slipped beyond her reach, and the realization that it had not been taken, but lost, settled in quietly, leaving her with nothing to correct, nothing to reclaim, only something to accept. Zariah had already stepped back into her role at the edge of the room, her hands now empty, her posture unchanged, as if the center had never belonged to her in the first place. And yet the space still carried the imprint of her presence, the shift she had created lingering long after her voice had gone still. One by one, the guests began to rise, not in a rush, not in disorder, but with a new awareness, conversations quieter, more focused, no longer shaped by appearance, but by implication, and as they moved toward the exit, more than one of them glanced back, not at Daniel, not at Claire, but at Zariah, as if trying to understand how someone they had not seen at all had become the most important person in the room. Daniel took a step toward her, not rushed, not performative, but deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the distance it had held at the beginning of the night. "You should not have been overlooked," he said, and the sentence was simple, direct, but it held the weight of something much larger than the moment itself, because it was not just about her. It was about what had been missed, what had been dismissed, what had been decided without full understanding. Zariah met his gaze briefly, not searching, not expecting anything, just acknowledging the words as they were, and then she looked down again, returning to the quiet composure that had defined her from the beginning. "I was not overlooked," she replied softly, her voice calm, certain. "I was unseen." The distinction settled deeper than anything else had that night, because being overlooked can be accidental, but being unseen is a choice made by those who decide what matters and what does not. Daniel did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to correct in what she had said, only something to understand. And as the last of the guests exited and the room began to empty, the city lights beyond the glass seemed sharper, clearer, as if reflecting the clarity that had finally entered the space inside. Zariah turned to leave, her steps quiet, measured, not hurried, not delayed, and she did not look back, not at the table, not at the people, not at the moment she had just changed, because she had not come for recognition, she had not come for acknowledgement, she had come to do her job, and when the moment required more, she had given it without hesitation and without expectation. Daniel remained where he stood, watching her walk away, not as someone losing control, but as someone finally understanding it, because control had never been about who spoke the loudest or who held the most power. It had always been about who saw clearly enough to act when it mattered. And in the quiet that followed, one truth remained, simple and undeniable, that the room had belonged to him when the night began, but it had changed hands the moment she chose to speak, not with force, not with volume, but with something far more powerful, clarity. And that night, clarity was the only thing no one could afford to ignore.
The stories shared on this channel are fictional and created purely for entertainment purposes, as well as to convey lessons about human behavior and interactions, regardless of race, religion, or background. promoting a life of equality and compassion. Any resemblance to real events, people, or places is purely coincidental.